The warm afternoon sunlight filtered through the large glass windows of Pemberton's Bistro, a renowned fine dining restaurant in Portland, Oregon. Inside, the atmosphere was tranquil, with soft murmurs of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the occasional melody from the live pianist in the corner. This was the kind of place where patrons came to celebrate life's milestones or close lucrative business deals. The polished decor, the tailored suits, and the elegantly set tables all contributed to an air of exclusivity. The entrance door swung open, and in walked an elderly black woman, her presence immediate and striking. She walked slowly but purposefully, her back straight despite the years that had etched themselves into her frame. She wore a navy blue coat with delicate embroidery along the cuffs, a small black handbag tucked securely under her arm. There was a quiet authority about her, an air of dignity that made a few heads turn. She wasn't the type of guest you would expect to see in a place like this, but there was something about her that commanded attention. The hostess, a young woman in her late 20s, greeted her with a smile, though it was just a bit too forced. It was a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes, as if she were doing the bare minimum to be polite. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, glancing briefly over her shoulder, almost as if she were hoping the woman might leave before she became a disruption. "Yes, under the name Mrs. Holloway," the elderly woman replied, her voice steady and polite, betraying none of the discomfort that might have crept in with the less than welcoming greeting. The hostess scanned the list and after a moment nodded and led her to a table tucked away in a corner near the kitchen, far from the prime seating by the windows, where more fashionable younger patrons were enjoying their meals. It wasn't the best table in the house, but Mrs. Holloway didn't complain. She simply sat down, folded her hands on the table, and glanced at the menu, though her eyes didn't linger long. The room was buzzing with energy, and yet despite her composed demeanor, Mrs. Holloway felt a growing unease. Something didn't feel right. The minutes passed, stretching into what felt like an eternity. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man in his late 20s named Todd, walked past her table multiple times, never once sparing her more than a brief glance. His smile was thin, his eyes flickering over her before moving on to the next table, where younger, more casually dressed diners seemed to be receiving immediate attention. The contrast was glaring. Todd finally approached her table, his smile tight and his tone clipped. "Sorry for the wait," he said briskly. "We're really busy right now. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Mrs. Holloway nodded graciously, thanking him for his attention, though her eyes followed him as he walked away, his indifference palpable. She was used to being overlooked, to being made to feel like she didn't belong in spaces like this, but today she would not let it get to her. She remained calm, her posture unyielding, as she waited. More time passed. Todd returned, but his demeanor had not changed. "I'm sorry," he said again, his voice flat. "We're a little understaffed today. Might be a while before I can get to you." Mrs. Holloway's lips pressed into a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed no frustration. "Take your time," she said softly. There was no complaint in her voice, only an understanding that she was being treated differently, though she chose not to make a scene. Around her, the discomfort was starting to become more noticeable. A couple sitting nearby exchanged nervous glances. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" the woman whispered to her partner, her voice barely audible above the ambient music. The man shrugged, glancing over at Todd, who seemed completely indifferent to the woman's presence. Another diner, a young man at a table across the room, furrowed his brow as he glanced between Miss Holloway and the staff, trying to piece together why she seemed so out of place. Mrs. Holloway remained poised, her gaze steady as she observed the room with quiet composure. She wasn't a stranger to this kind of subtle mistreatment, the kind that wasn't loud or overt, but made itself known in every delayed service and dismissive glance. And still, she held herself with grace, her hands resting gently on the table as if she were merely passing the time. Todd busied himself with nearby tables, cracking jokes, smiling easily, and taking orders from other patrons. He laughed with a young couple sitting near the bar, his tone light and effortless, while Mrs. Holloway sat quietly, her glass of water now empty. She reached for it, but it hadn't been refilled, despite the fact that a few tables away, a waiter had delivered a fresh glass of wine to a customer who had arrived long after her. Todd passed her table once again, his eyes avoiding hers completely. "Still haven't decided?" he asked, his tone bordering on dismissive, as though the delay were her fault. Mrs. Holloway looked up at him, her eyes steady and kind, yet carrying a quiet intensity that made him falter. "I'm ready to order whenever you have a moment," she said, her voice measured and polite. Todd muttered something under his breath, his expression hardening, before he turned away without acknowledging her. At this moment, a man sitting at a table near the bar observed everything. Elijah Holloway, a man in his late 30s, had been quietly watching the entire scene. His sharp eyes had noticed every subtle slight and dismissive glance. Elijah was the restaurant's owner, and the woman being ignored by the staff wasn't just another guest, she was his mother. And watching her be treated like this in his own restaurant stirred a deep, slow-burning anger inside him. As the minutes stretched on, the tension in the room began to build. Elijah Holloway sat quietly at his table, watching Todd continue to dismiss his mother. Every action from the young waiter, every ignored glance, was like a slow burn that fed the anger building inside him. Elijah had seen his fair share of frustrating moments in the restaurant industry, but nothing compared to watching his mother, the woman who had shaped him, who had given him everything, be treated with such disregard in his own establishment. His grip tightened around his glass as he observed the indifference Todd showed to his mother. Elijah had built Pemberton's Bistro from the ground up, putting his heart and soul into making it a place that respected every guest. But right now, he wasn't just the restaurant owner. He was a son who was witnessing his mother being treated like she didn't belong. And that wasn't something he could simply sit by and watch. Todd, meanwhile, seemed completely oblivious to the storm brewing in the corner of the room. He moved from table to table, laughing with guests, taking orders, and chatting casually with customers. Yet each time he passed Mrs. Holloway, he barely even acknowledged her presence, much less offered her the same level of service he had been so eager to provide to others. It wasn't just a lapse in professionalism, it was a blatant disregard for her dignity. Elijah had been watching closely for a while now, and every passing second only made his anger grow. He could feel the weight of the moment, the weight of every patron in the room who had noticed the subtle mistreatment. They were all watching silently, some with uncomfortable glances, others exchanging looks, but no one was speaking up. Elijah knew that this was more than just a small mistake. It was a reflection of something much deeper. It was a test of character, and Elijah knew that it was time for action. Still, Elijah remained seated, observing, waiting for the right moment. He didn't want to act out of anger. He had been in this business long enough to know that patience was often the best tool in handling difficult situations. But this was different. This was his mother, and Elijah wasn't going to let her be treated like she was invisible. Across the room, Mrs. Holloway continued to sit with quiet grace, her calm expression betraying nothing of the frustration or discomfort she must have felt. She was used to this kind of treatment. It wasn't the first time she had been subtly pushed aside because of her age or race, but she wasn't going to let it define her. She wasn't going to make a scene. Instead, she chose to remain composed, confident that the moment would eventually reveal the truth. But Elijah wasn't so patient. He could feel the injustice building, the disrespect bubbling to the surface, and he knew it was only a matter of time before it would explode. His eyes never left Todd, who was now laughing with a group of young patrons at a nearby table, completely unaware of the storm about to hit. It was then that Elijah made his decision. He stood up from his table, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The room seemed to quiet down, almost as if it could sense the change in the air. The pianist, who had been playing softly in the corner, stopped mid-note, his fingers hovering over the keys. The staff, who had been moving around the restaurant with ease, suddenly paused, their attention turning toward Elijah. He walked across the room, his presence commanding attention without a single word. His steps were measured, each one bringing him closer to Todd. who had just finished joking with a nearby table. Todd turned to leave, only to freeze when he saw Elijah standing right beside him. Todd's smile faltered as confusion spread across his face. "Oh, hey, Elijah," he said, trying to force a smile, his voice a little too nervous. "I didn't know you were here." "I've been here," Elijah said calmly, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. "I've been watching." Todd's confusion deepened as Elijah's gaze shifted toward Mrs. Holloway's table. "I've been watching you ignore my mother, who's been sitting at that table for almost 30 minutes without so much as a glass of water." The color drained from Todd's face as he glanced over at Mrs. Holloway, who sat quietly, her calm gaze now locked on the interaction between her son and the waiter. Todd's mind raced, but he couldn't come up with an excuse. "She's your mother?" Todd stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes, my mother," Elijah replied, his tone sharpening. "The woman you treated like an inconvenience, the woman you thought didn't deserve the same respect you've been showering on every other table in this room?" The room went deathly silent. Every eye in the restaurant was now on the confrontation unfolding before them. Even the pianist stood still, his hands hovering above the keys, unsure of what to do. Todd opened his mouth to say something, but Elijah cut him off before he could speak. "Save it," Elijah said, his voice cold. "There's no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here has seen it." Elijah turned to the manager, Dana, who had been standing near the bar, unsure of whether to intervene. "Dana," Elijah said, his voice steady but firm, "take over table 12 and make sure my mother has everything she needs, immediately." Dana nodded quickly, rushing to Mrs. Holloway's table, her face apologetic, as she refilled her glass and offered a heartfelt apology. Elijah turned back to Todd, his gaze unyielding. "We'll discuss your future here later," he said. "For now, you're done for the day. Go home." Todd stood frozen for a moment, his face a mix of humiliation and regret. He muttered something under his breath before finally untangling his apron and walking out of the restaurant. The heavy door swung shut behind him with a sharp click, leaving the room in an uneasy silence. As Elijah approached his mother's table, he crouched slightly to meet her gaze, his stern demeanor softening into something warmer. "You okay, Mom?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Holloway smiled, reaching out to pat his hand. "I'm fine, son," she said softly. "You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I should have stepped in sooner." "No," she replied gently. "You let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than confronting someone right away." As the restaurant slowly returned to its usual rhythm, Elijah reflected on the lesson that had been imparted, not just to Todd or the staff, but to everyone who had witnessed the moment. It wasn't just about correcting a wrong. It was about integrity, respect, and the quiet strength of standing up for what's right. The restaurant was silent now, the air thick with tension as Elijah's words hung in the air. Todd, the young waiter, stood frozen, his face pale as he absorbed the full impact of what had just transpired. In an instant, his demeanor shifted from casual arrogance to sheer discomfort. The realization that his actions had been seen, not just by one person but by the entire room, was hitting him hard. Elijah's calm yet firm confrontation had exposed him for what he was, someone who had allowed his biases to dictate his behavior. Elijah wasn't done yet. His presence alone had commanded the room's attention, but he knew that this moment was about more than just Todd's immediate consequences. It was about setting a precedent. He wasn't going to let what had happened to his mother slide under the radar. He wasn't going to let this kind of behavior become normalized, especially in a place he had worked so hard to build. Pemberton's Bistro wasn't just about fine dining. It was about respect, dignity, and making every guest feel valued. As Todd stood there, still processing the situation, Elijah turned back to the staff. His gaze was sharp, but it wasn't filled with anger. It was focused, deliberate. He wasn't just speaking to Todd. He was speaking to everyone in the room. "I've worked hard to make this restaurant a place of respect," Elijah began, his voice steady and unwavering. This is not just a business to me, it's a reflection of the values I believe in, and those values do not include treating people like they're invisible. That's not who we are, and it's certainly not how we treat anyone who walks through these doors, no matter who they are or where they come from." The room seemed to hold its breath as Elijah's words settled. He wasn't just reprimanding Todd. He was reminding everyone of the standards they should be holding themselves to. This wasn't just about a mistake that one employee had made. It was about creating a culture where respect and equality weren't just ideals, but the foundation of everything they did. Elijah turned his attention back to the manager, Dana, who had been standing nearby watching the entire interaction unfold. He could see the discomfort in her expression, but he also saw something else, a quiet understanding. Dana had been with him since the early days of the restaurant, and he knew she shared his commitment to making the place more than just another fine dining spot. "Dana, I need you to take over for Todd at table 12, Elijah instructed, his tone now softer but no less firm. "Make sure Mrs. Holloway has everything she needs, apologize to her sincerely, and make sure the rest of the team understands that this is not how we do things here." Dana nodded immediately, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and determination. "Of course, Elijah, I'll make sure it's handled," she said, her voice steady. She walked swiftly to Mrs. Holloway's table, offering a sincere apology and refilling her glass of water. Mrs. Holloway accepted the apology gracefully, her expression unchanged. She didn't need grand gestures. She had handled this entire situation with quiet dignity, and now she simply wanted to enjoy her meal in peace. Elijah watched Dana's movements for a moment, ensuring she took care of the situation, before turning his attention back to Todd. The young waiter still stood frozen, his eyes darting around the room, clearly unsure of what to do next. Elijah's gaze was unwavering as he approached him once more. "You're done for the day, Todd," Elijah said, his voice sharp and final. "I'll speak to you tomorrow about your future here." Todd's face flushed a deep red, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to formulate a response, but no words came out. He knew he had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Without another word, he untied his apron, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was walking in slow motion as he realized the consequences of his actions. The door to the restaurant swung open, and Todd left, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Elijah didn't watch him go. He turned back to Mrs. Holloway, who had remained composed through it all. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence, her grace, had spoken volumes. Elijah approached her table, his expression softening as he crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "You okay, Mom?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying a tenderness that only a son could express for his mother. Mrs. Holloway smiled, her expression calm as always. "I'm fine, son," she said, her voice warm. "You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, his shoulders finally relaxing. "I should have stepped in sooner," he admitted, his eyes dropping for a moment. He had wanted to handle it with patience, but seeing his mother treated with such disregard had pushed him to act. He was proud of how he had handled the situation, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he should have stepped in earlier. "No, you didn't," she replied gently. "You let him reveal his character. Sometimes that's more powerful than confronting someone right away." Elijah smiled softly at his mother's wisdom. She had always been a steady influence in his life, guiding him with quiet strength and grace. Tonight had been a reminder of just how much he had learned from her. He had wanted to act with integrity, and he had done so. But more importantly, he had shown others the power of standing up against mistreatment. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in Pemberton's bistro shifted. The conversation around the room resumed, but the energy had changed. The diners who had witnessed the scene now viewed Mrs. Holloway with a mixture of respect and quiet admiration. Some exchanged glances, thoughtful looks that suggested they were processing the lesson they had just witnessed. It wasn't just about the service, it was about the deeper values of respect and fairness that had been put on display. Elijah sat down at his table again, his face still composed, but the lingering anger in his eyes hadn't entirely faded. He knew the night wasn't over and there was still work to be done. He had learned a valuable lesson, too. Leadership wasn't just about managing a business, it was about maintaining the integrity and values that defined the place. It was about making sure every person, no matter their background, their age, or their appearance, felt valued and respected. As the evening wound down, Elijah felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He had done what was right, and he knew that this moment would stick with everyone who had witnessed it. In a world that too often turned a blind eye to injustice, he had chosen to act, and in doing so he had shown everyone in that room the power of standing up for what was right. The moment Todd walked out of the restaurant, the atmosphere seemed to shift. It was as if the weight of his departure left an air of anticipation in the room, a tension that lingered long after he had gone. The pianist resumed playing, but the music didn't fill the space in the same way it had before. The quiet murmur of conversation picked up again, but something fundamental had changed. The guests at Pemberton's Bistro were no longer just dining, they were processing what had just happened, and for many it was a moment they would not soon forget. Elijah stood by his mother's table, watching as she calmly returned to her meal, her composure unchanged by the events that had just unfolded. The grace with which she handled the entire situation was something Elijah admired, but it also reminded him of how different things could have been if he hadn't stepped in. The reality of it all started to sink in. His mother had been treated unjustly simply because of her appearance, and for too long people had allowed it to happen without challenging the status quo. He stood there for a moment, taking a deep breath. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride for the way his mother had handled herself, but the anger that had been building within him since he first noticed Todd's behavior still simmered beneath the surface. He had wanted to show respect for the way his mother handled things without confrontation, but now, more than ever, he realized how important it was to speak up when something was wrong, no matter how small the slight seemed at first. The truth was, the confrontation wasn't just about Todd. It was about something much larger. It was about a culture of silence, a willingness to ignore subtle injustice because it didn't seem overt. But Elijah had learned over the years that silence was often complicit in allowing those moments of mistreatment to continue. And it was only when people, especially those in positions of power, took a stand that change would happen. Elijah's thoughts were interrupted when Dana, the manager, returned to Mrs. Holloway's table. She was carrying a tray of food, an apologetic smile on her face as she set the plates down. Mrs. Holloway looked up at Dana, who immediately began to apologize for the way things had unfolded. "I am so sorry for the way you were treated, Mrs. Holloway," Dana said, her voice sincere. "That's not how we run things here. We've taken care of it. If you need anything else, please don't hesitate to ask." Mrs. Holloway simply nodded, her expression calm and collected. She hadn't asked for any special treatment. She simply wanted to be treated with the same respect that anyone else would receive. It was clear that her dignity wasn't something that could be compromised by the actions of one person, but it didn't mean that what happened didn't matter. And while she wasn't one to demand grand gestures, the way the staff had responded showed that the lesson was not lost on them. Elijah sat down at his table, his mind racing. He looked around the room, noting the way the staff had now become more attentive, more thoughtful in their service. It was as if the entire restaurant had learned something profound in that moment. And while he didn't expect everyone to change overnight, he was hopeful that the behavior that had taken place earlier wouldn't be tolerated again. But more than anything, Elijah knew that this wasn't just about his restaurant. It was about the broader message that had been conveyed. This moment, though seemingly small, was a reminder to every person in that room about the importance of standing up against injustice when it rears its ugly head, no matter how subtle. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about showing respect for others, even when they might not ask for it directly. It was about being aware of the power dynamics at play and taking responsibility for your actions. As Elijah sat there, watching the restaurant return to its usual rhythm, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't about the confrontation with Todd. It was about the fact that everyone in that room, from the staff to the patrons, had seen what had happened and would remember it. They would remember the quiet dignity of his mother, the way she handled the situation without complaint, and the way the restaurant had responded. And hopefully they would remember the lesson that had been imparted, not just about customer service, but about how people should treat one another in every space they occupy. For Elijah, this was a pivotal moment. It reaffirmed everything he had built with Pemberton's Bistro. He had created a space where people came to enjoy not just a meal, but an experience, one that was rooted in respect, fairness, and dignity. And that night, as the restaurant quieted down and the last few patrons finished their meals, he knew that the lesson of the evening wasn't just for Todd or even for the staff. It was a lesson for everyone who had witnessed the moment, about the power of standing up, about the importance of respecting others, and about how we all have the ability to create change, one action at a time. As Mrs. Holloway finished her meal, she looked around the room one last time. Her gaze met Dana's, who offered her a small, apologetic smile. Mrs. Holloway responded with a quiet nod, her expression unreadable but somehow content. The room might have returned to its usual hum, but the impact of the moment lingered. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest change doesn't come from loud speeches or grand gestures. It comes from quiet acts of integrity, the courage to stand tall, and the strength to do what's right, even when no one else is watching. Elijah walked his mother to the door as the night came to a close. The door swung open, and she stepped out into the cool evening air, her figure illuminated by the soft glow from the restaurant windows. For a moment they stood there together, looking at each other without saying a word. Then Mrs. Holloway turned back toward him and smiled, the warmth in her expression easing the weight of the day's events. "You did good, son," she said softly. Elijah smiled faintly, his heart still heavy but proud. "I still wish it hadn't happened." "What matters," she said, placing a hand gently on his arm, "is how you responded. You gave everyone in there something to think about, something they'll carry with them. That's the real change." As Elijah watched his mother get into the car, he knew she was right. Change didn't always come in loud, dramatic moments. Sometimes it came in the quiet strength of standing up for what was right. And for him, this moment, though difficult, had been a powerful reminder of what he wanted to build, not just in his restaurant, but in the world around him. As the evening wound down, the mood in Pemberton's Bistro had shifted significantly. What started as a subtle but glaring injustice had transformed into an undeniable lesson for everyone present. The soft chatter of patrons resumed, but the air in the room had changed. There was a quiet intensity now. A sense that something deeper had taken place. The staff moved with a heightened sense of awareness, ensuring that every guest felt valued, while the diners who had witnessed the confrontation with Todd could not shake the image of Elijah's stand for respect and dignity. Elijah, though, didn't feel a sense of triumph as he sat back down at his table. He still felt the weight of what had occurred. His gaze wandered across the room, taking in the now calm atmosphere. It had been a hard decision to intervene. He had wanted to maintain the integrity of his restaurant and address the situation with patience, but as he watched his mother, his anchor, sitting there quietly, enduring the subtle mistreatment, he knew it was time to act, and he was glad he had. His thoughts drifted back to the early days of Pemberton's Bistro, the countless hours spent building the restaurant, ensuring it wasn't just another dining establishment, but a place where people could come and feel respected, appreciated, and valued. He had poured his heart and soul into it. It wasn't just about good food and fine wines. It was about creating an atmosphere where people felt seen, heard, and treated as equals. But tonight, in his own restaurant, his mother had been treated as though she didn't belong, as if her presence wasn't worthy of the same respect others received. That stung more than anything. Yet through it all, Mrs. Holloway had remained composed, even graceful in the face of mistreatment. Her ability to endure with such dignity had not only diffused the situation, but it had also revealed something important to Elijah. Sometimes the quietest responses are the most powerful. The evening had left its mark on him, not just as a business owner, but as a man, a son. He had learned a valuable lesson about leadership. Leadership wasn't just about managing people or operations. It was about setting the tone, upholding values, and stepping in when necessary to protect those values, even if it meant confronting uncomfortable truths. As he sat quietly, deep in thought, Dana, the restaurant's manager, approached him. She had been a part of Pemberton's Bistro since its early days, and Elijah trusted her judgment. He could see the look in her eyes. She had witnessed the entire exchange between him and Todd. She had seen the disappointment and discomfort in the room, but she had also seen the change it sparked. "Everything's under control now," Dana said, her voice calm but serious. "The team's already talking about it. They know what happened, and I think they're all taking it to heart." Elijah nodded, appreciative of her steady approach. "Good. It needed to happen," he said, his voice reflecting the lingering weight of the situation. "It's not just about Todd, it's about all of us, about the kind of place we want this to be." Dana nodded again, looking toward Mrs. Holloway's table, where the elderly woman sat, still calm and composed, her meal finished. "I think they're all going to remember this," Dana said thoughtfully. "It's hard to ignore what happened, and the way your mom handled it. It was a powerful example." Elijah glanced over at his mother. Her graceful acceptance of the apology from the staff had left a lasting impression on him. She wasn't one to seek attention, but her quiet dignity spoke louder than any words ever could. He had learned that evening that leadership could take many forms. Sometimes it came in the form of taking immediate action, and sometimes it came in the form of letting others reveal their true character, like Todd had done that night. As the night drew to a close and the last patrons began to filter out of the restaurant, Elijah couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't the kind of satisfaction that came from winning or being right. It was the kind of satisfaction that came from knowing he had done what was necessary to uphold the values he had worked so hard to build. This moment wasn't just about the confrontation with Todd. It was about ensuring that Pemberton's Bistro would continue to be a place where people were treated with the respect they deserved. Outside the restaurant, the cool night air hit Elijah's face as he walked his mother to the car. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk as they approached the curb, the evening's events still fresh in his mind. His mother, as always, walked with grace, her poise never faltering. When they reached the car, Mrs. Holloway stopped and turned to face her son, her expression warm but knowing. "You did well, son," she said softly. "I'm proud of you." Elijah looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of the night's events. "I still wish it hadn't happened," he confessed. "I wish I didn't have to step in at all." His mother smiled gently and placed a hand on his arm. "What matters is how you responded. You gave everyone in there something to think about. Sometimes that's more important than fixing it right away." Her words settled over him like a warm blanket. He knew she was right. Sometimes it wasn't about having all the answers or fixing everything in the moment. Sometimes it was about letting people see the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. And in doing so, you could start the process of real change. As Mrs. Holloway got into the car and Elijah closed the door behind her, he paused for a moment, watching her drive away into the night. He stood there for a moment longer, deep in thought. It wasn't just about the restaurant. It was about the bigger picture, the world outside the restaurant doors, the world that needed more people who would stand up when they saw something wrong, who would refuse to let injustice slide, and who would treat every person with dignity. As Elijah turned back toward the restaurant, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The night had not only reaffirmed his commitment to the values he had built his restaurant on, but it had also reminded him of the larger fight for respect, kindness, and justice in the world. That fight would never stop, and he would continue to lead by example, knowing that every action, no matter how small, could inspire change. The evening had ended, but its impact would linger. It wasn't just a lesson for the staff or the guests, it was a lesson for Elijah himself, and he knew that it was one he would carry with him for the rest of his life. As the night wrapped up, the atmosphere in Pemberton's Bistro slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The soft hum of conversation filled the room, The clinking of glasses continued, and the pianist's fingers danced lightly across the keys. But there was something deeper at play that would stay with everyone who had witnessed the evening's events. The moment had left a lasting impression, not just for the way Elijah handled the situation, but for the lesson it imparted to all who saw it unfold. Elijah had learned that leadership wasn't just about managing a business or delivering great service. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. It was about setting the tone for respect, equality, and fairness, no matter who walks through your doors. His mother, with her quiet dignity and grace, had shown him that sometimes the best way to handle injustice is to let others reveal themselves, to let their actions speak for them. It was a reminder that sometimes silence isn't golden. Sometimes in order to create real change, you need to stand up, speak out, and take action. The smallest moments of mistreatment add up, and it's only when people refuse to stay silent that a shift begins to happen. The world, whether in a restaurant or elsewhere, can only become a better place if we all hold ourselves accountable, step up when needed, and fight for the respect and fairness that everyone deserves. The story of Elijah, Mrs. Holloway, and Todd isn't just about a small incident in a restaurant. It's a reminder for all of us, whether we're in positions of power or just bystanders. We all have a responsibility to ensure that dignity and respect are at the core of how we treat others. It's a call to action for all of us to stand against injustice, big or small, and to lead by example in our everyday lives. If you found this story impactful, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please comment with the number 1 if you liked the video, and if you think there's something I could improve to make the content even better, comment with the number 00. Your feedback means a lot and helps me keep making content that inspires and empowers. Remember, every day is an opportunity to make a difference. Let's all stand for respect, dignity, and fairness. Together we can create real change.